Welcome to session 2 in Centering Indigenous Pedagogies in Math Education. And I know that Cynthia will talk a little bit more about this image a little bit later. I'm joining you from Syilx territory, which is colonial known as the Okanagan, and I'm just so fortunate to have spent the last 14 years here learning from and with elders and knowledge keepers and the land. And just a few images of the wonderful work I've been able to engage with, including the floodplain re-engagement project, which is a Syilx led project with Indigenous scientists around returning plants and animals that were once here to thrive back into our ecosystem. And we're just so happy that you're able to join us. If you haven't had a chance to share in the chat box yet, we invite you and welcome you to share and locate yourself in the chat box. This webinar series is in partnership, and so we're so thrilled to be partnering with the Indigenous Math Network, with the David Robitaille International STEM Education Network that Cynthia leads, with Dogwood 25. We're grateful for the financial support of the BC Ministry of Education and the Rural Education Advisory, all in partnership together, working to offer this work and join us in community across the province and beyond.
This webinar series is about centering Indigenous pedagogies in mathematics education. And this session is on the power of teaching and learning mathematics through land and place. The session contains a section of sensitive content focused on Highway 16, also known as the Highway of Tears in northern British Columbia, Canada, and on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls along this stretch of highway in BC and also across Canada. Welcome, everybody. My name is Cynthia Nicol, and I'm a professor in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy, and I hold the chair for the David Robitaille Professorship in Mathematics and Science Education. And it's a pleasure to be co-hosting this webinar on centering Indigenous pedagogies in math education with my colleagues. And this is as mentioned, this is our second session in the series. So if you haven't already, please think about the land that you're located on and introduce yourselves in the chat. And I'd like to acknowledge that the webinar series is hosted by the University of British Columbia, situated on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam people. So while you're introducing yourself, for those who are just coming into the room, I'd like to introduce you to this two-faced Gogit. It's a transformation mask carved by Haida artist Reg Davidson. And Reg comes from a long line of carvers and artists. And he's well known for his carved masks and poles and canoes. And he carves and then performs his art as a member of the Haida dance group called the Rainbow Creek Dancers. And he carves and sings and dances his work in the Pacific Northwest on the islands of Haida Gwaii. And you can see the connection to the land, and this place is amazing. And you can see how it inspires this kind of art. The Gogit mask is a transformation mask, and if you open it, you can sort of see the strings on the side there. They're actually like piano hinges that opens up, and inside is human. The outside, Reg explained to me, is a Gogit, which is a very wild spirit thing, a spirit that's too strong to die. And this idea of human inside, Gogit on the outside, kind of reminds us of that balance between the human and the more than human. So today we're going to talk a bit about the power of teaching and learning mathematics through land and place. You can see that this is the second in our series of 4. And we'll talk a little bit more of the upcoming sessions towards the end of our presentation. But I want to talk a little bit about place as a way to kind of situate our thinking about place and its connection to teaching and learning mathematics. So according to Tim Cresswell, who draws on some work in the human geography area, in particular John Agnew, he writes that place needs 3 things. He defines it with 3 things. The first thing he defines it by is saying that place has location. So it can be marked on a map in a particular location. So I've kind of marked at the bottom here, you can see where Vancouver is with its longitude and latitude. And up further up is where Carol, one of our presenters, is in Hazelton. And I can mark those two places and maybe even find the angle difference between the two. But this is through longitude and latitude, looking at the center of the Earth and measuring how far up from the equator in degrees are each of us. So that's one way to talk about and think about place. It has location. But place also has locale. And it functions in this way as a way of coming together for social relations. So here is a pole raising on Haida Gwaii that happened in the fall. This pole was actually carved by Reg Davidson. So people are coming together for that. It's a function for social relations. Here you can see football game in Vancouver with the BC Lions and the Saskatchewan Rough Riders, a game that I attended in the fall as well. And here, another place where people have to come together in the garden, outside kids working together. So these are all places that have locale and have a way of bringing people together. And a third idea of place from a human geography perspective is that place has meaning. So here's a photo of residents on campus at UBC. And inside, here's a room of a student trying to make this place home. And you can see that trying to make the place have meaning by putting in things that remind the student of home, like a map and other ways of making it feel like that it has meaning for them. Now, these are all ways of thinking about place that are very human-centric. And there are other ways to think about place. And if you look at this quote here by Danish scholar Glenn Floutard, he talks about place is a way of knowing, experiencing, and relating with each other in a world, and it's a field of relationships of things to each other. So other ways of thinking about place from Indigenous perspectives emphasize how place is something where we don't necessarily, humans don't own the place, but instead the place owns them. And here is an example of thinking about Indigenous perspectives of place. And you can download this document online by Herman Michel and colleagues talking about place, Indigenous place from Indigenous perspective as having 5 different facets. So it's multidimensional, it's relational, it's experiential, it's local, and it's land-based. And land in this idea is considered to be alive and considered to be as teacher. So thinking about Indigenous perspectives of place and thinking about how we might kind of challenge more colonial human-centric perspectives of place, where place is there for humans to use. David Greenwood of Lakehead University in Ontario, Canada, offers 3 questions as a way to kind of challenge these more colonial logics way of thinking about place. And he asks, to think about historically what happened here in this place. And then to think about currently what is happening here now and what is going on. And that's a social ecological question. And then the third question, thinking about what should happen here, a more of an ethical question. So what has happened in the past, what's happening here now, and what should happen here in the future. So I'm offering these questions and frameworks as a way for us to think about place. And then we're going to have some examples from teachers on the work that they're doing. And finally, one other way of thinking about place is Indigenous Storywork. And it's also like a pedagogy of place, emphasizing these principles, these 7 principles of Indigenous Storywork, because they're connected. Story and land are very much connected. And we talked quite a bit about this in our first session, so you can go back to session 1 of this series and learn more about that series, which was called Mathematical Moments of Indigenous Storywork. Okay, so now we're going to introduce our speakers who will talk about and think about some examples of the kinds of ideas that I've just shared with you. So I'm going to invite Joanne Archibald William to now introduce our speakers.
Great. ASYL. Thanks, Cynthia. I'm joining you from the traditional unceded lands of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Indigenous nations in the Vancouver area. And as Cynthia mentioned, with this map, we see four dots there. And as I talk about these individuals, you probably could associate the dots with where the person is located. So we are today honored to have two presenters who will share their experiences in bringing together Indigenous ways of knowing and connecting that with learning mathematics and learning through land and place. So we, one of our presenters is Tawnie Hildebrandt, who lives and works on the traditional and unceded territory of the Samath and Matsqui First Nations in Stalo territory. Tawnie is a numeracy helping teacher for the Abbotsford School District, and prior to her current role, she worked as a classroom teacher in the elementary school. And our second presenter, Carol Bob, is a member of the Wolfslux and Wolfslus. Her hereditary name is Stastaan, which means helping hand, and this is in the Gitxsan Nation. Carol works at Hazelton Secondary School in northern British Columbia, and she teaches mathematics to grade 8 and also to grade 10 to 12 students. After each of the presentations, we will have two educators who are going to be curriculum responders to the presenters. In our first session, we had witnesses, which is an adaptation from the Coast Salish practice of witnessing at different gatherings. And we thought we'd try a different role this time, but there are some similarities in that with the witness and the curriculum responder, each person, you know, will observe, will think about, will feel, you know, what is happening in that presentation. And then the curriculum responder will share some thoughts, perhaps some an idea that has created a spark for them to perhaps apply the teaching ideas to a different grade level or thinking about place in a different way. So we have two curriculum responders, one Monica Bergeron, who lives and works on the unceded lands of the Tk'emlúps to Secwepemc territory. She is a district numeracy coordinator for School District 73, and prior to this role, she was a middle and high school math and science teacher for over 20 years. Our other curriculum responder, Sandra Fox, lives and works on the unceded and traditional ancestral territories of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. She works for the Vancouver School Board as a district curriculum support teacher for K-7 with a math focus. And other members of our team, you've already met Leyton and Cynthia, and Janice Nowakowski is also our team member and helping us out today. So I'm very pleased to now ask Tawnie to please share your thoughts with us.
Hello, thanks for inviting me. I'm super excited to be here. I'm going to be sharing about my experience in using the story of Chehalis as we explored how we could connect land and place with mathematics. We can move to the next slide. And I will give you an idea of where I am. I want to acknowledge that I am on the traditional and unceded territory of the Stalo people, the Mathaqui and the Samath First Nations. This is a photo from a retired colleague at the top of a local hike in Abbotsford, and I think it's a beautiful photo. It looks out over the valley of Abbotsford, and if you keep looking past those mountains, you can see the peaks of Mount Baker. And what I really love about this photo is that this would have been Sumath Lake. This was flooded in 2021. You probably may have seen that on the news. And so I just like to think about this photo and what it would have been when it was the lake. So that's a little bit about what it looks like from where I currently am and where I am from. And this next slide will show you sort of where I am in relation to other places in British Columbia. So you can see Abbotsford in relation to Vancouver, and that red dot that's been dropped, that's where Chehalis Lake is. It's a bit north of where I am, about 45 minutes or so away from where I am. And just wanted to give you some context about what we're going to be talking about today and the story that I'm going to be sharing about where that is. And so this is a better visual for you. And this is one of the pictures that we shared with the students who we worked with to help the students understand not just where Chehalis is located in relation to where we were, but we really wanted to help them understand what it looked like. And so we chose a story. And I say we because this lesson was done in collaboration with another helping teacher who's currently on leave. So I'm representing both of us at the moment. And so we chose a story that we thought could build connections between story and place and mathematics. And so this gives you a better idea what it looks like. And that story was the story of Chehalis. This is part of the Stalo CTEL curriculum from the Kokalitsa Cultural Education Center. The center focuses on promoting, preserving, and interpreting Stalo lifestyle and language and traditions and heritage from the Stalo point of view. And so the Stalo CTEL curriculum has been created to help with that. It includes this story, the story of Chehalis, which is part of a collection of other local traditional stories that have been told. My goal in the work that I was doing last year and continues to be part of the work that I'm doing was to explore how I can use Indigenous storywork and principles of Indigenous storywork to explore math and explore place in math. And so Taryn and I, the other teacher who we collaborated, we had to find a class to work with. And so we found a very willing teacher, and we worked with her grade 4-5 class last year over a couple of lessons. Everything was focused on this book. And so before we talk about the story, though, I want to talk about Ed Leon. And this is the work that we did with the students, too, was we started by sharing about Ed Leon because he is the one who was telling the story. And this is an oral story, and it's been shared as it was told by Ed Leon in the book, which I have right here. Ed was born on this Chehalis Reserve. He was born on October 25th, 1899. I found that date today. I found his obituary, and I just thought 1899, so close to almost being 1900, and I believe he died in 1980. And so I still get chills when I think about that turn of the century there. There's a biography in the book, and we shared that with students. And some of the highlights that the students really connected with was that Ed had 5 children, 21 grandchildren, 22 great-grandchildren, and 5 great-great-grandchildren. The students really connected with that. They had audible responses to thinking about all of those family members. In the biography, it talks about how Ed was a storyteller, a gifted storyteller, and he was a hunter, and he was a trapper. And it talks about that his family shared that he taught them so much through telling unforgettable stories. Also shared that Ed taught them to hang and mend nets and smoke fish and set a net. Because this is an oral story as told by Ed Leon, when I shared this story, I read it word for word. And so one of the things that I grappled with in the moment as I prepared to read the story was that it's called the story of Chehalis. And so I read it as the story of Chehalis and not Chehalis, which is the Hulkamelan word. That took discussion with Taryn and with our Indigenous department to figure out what is the best way to move forward with the story. And so I read it exactly how it had been recorded. So to give you a little bit of an idea about the story, so you can see the context of the work that the students did and how they connected to place, the story of Chehalis is about two groups of people that really had to come together to survive in the place of Chehalis. There's one group, it was Alex Joseph's people, lived at the mouth of the Chehalis Creek. And another group, Johnny Paul's family, lived at Chehalis Lake, and they didn't know about each other. And so the story goes on to talk about that Alex Joseph's people built a fish trap, and it was at the mouth of Chehalis Creek. And that one season there wasn't super great for fish, and so the trap caught most of the fish, which meant that not a lot of fish got through the trap, which meant a lot of fish got up to the lake. And so that's where Johnny Paul's family was, and they realized there wasn't the same amount of fish as they normally would see. So Johnny Paul's family sent a foot runner to find out what was happening. And in the story, it talks about how the foot runner was very fast. The foot runner would train until he could catch a bird. And that the foot runner was a hunter and also delivered messages. So they sent the foot runner a great distance all the way down to the mouth of the creek to figure out what was happening. And that's where he discovered the fish trap. So he went back and he shared about the fish trap, and he had a few journeys back and forth to figure out what to do. And so eventually he broke some of the cedar poles that were in the trap so that his people could eat and survive, so fish could make its way up to the lake. When Alex Joseph's people discovered that the trap had been broken, they ended up catching the foot runner. They had absolutely no idea that there were people up at the lake. And so the chiefs from each of the group ended up meeting, and Alex Joseph's people welcomed Johnny Paul's people from the lake down to the Creek village, joining the two villages to be what is Chehalis. That is a very brief summary of the story. And so this map gives you a better idea about where the two families were in the story. So you can see Johnny Paul's people are way up at the top of that map by Chehalis Lake, and Alex Joseph people were down at the bottom at the mouth of the creek. So we shared this map with students, but we also shared this map with students. We wanted to connect them not just to the idea of what that looked like, but we also needed to connect students to where we were in relation to Chehalis. And so the orange circle is where the story is happening, and the green circle is where the Mathaqui and Samath nations are. And you can see the orange would have been Samath Lake before it was drained. So this helped students connect to where they were. And then we showed them this photo to also give them idea about the land and the water that's in the story, because we really needed to put into context for them that it's not just flat. It doesn't look like Abbotsford does right now, for them to understand the hills and the mountains and the trees and the water, to put the story in context of the place and the land, which was going to be really important for the work we wanted to invite them to do as they listen to the story. And so our first day of working with the story, we explained to the students that they were going to hear the story, and I was going to read it exactly the way that it was had been recorded, and that we wanted to stop 3 times as we read. And the goal of stopping was for them to think about in the story, where do mathematical moments happen in the story? So we gave them some sentence stems to start with. The idea of, I think there's math here, and it could be this kind of math, along with I noticed and I wondered. And this was more challenging than we thought it would be. So we stopped along the way in different parts of the story and gave students Post-it notes and let them turn and talk and record their ideas. And you can see them represented on the whiteboard there. And we started to stack the ones where we noticed that there was a lot of interest happening. And so students picked up on small things in the book. The story talks about how there's dried sockeye salmon that was used as a torch, and the kids were fascinated by this. But they also had questions about the foot runner and how could he be so fast that he could catch a bird. And then they really started to pick up on the fishing weir. And they started to figure out that that had some math moments in it. Specifying what those math moments were was a challenge. And so we decided that on our second day back with the class, that's where we were really going to dig in. And how could we help students learn about the fishing weir while also learning about place and the land, along with mathematics. So the first thing we did is we went back to the story, and this is a scan from one of the pages from the story, and we asked them, what do we need to know? Because we proposed to them that they were going to build a smaller scale model of the fishing weir that we learned about in the story. And so we went back to the story. This paragraph is talking about how they split the cedar and they set it right across the creek, and they set the rock where the trap can be opened, just enough for a fish to get through. And so those little pieces that were in the story help students suddenly start to connect to the mathematics that was part of it, and understanding this rock is being used as a spacer between the cedar poles. This led to some questions about how far apart the poles really were, and this led to questions about the fish that were coming up the river. How big were they? And so Taryn, the teacher who I planned this with, we did some pre-research because we knew that we hoped that this question would come about. And we discovered that no matter where we looked, we couldn't figure out how wide the salmon was to have the space for the cedar poles. And so we thought, well, how would someone know? And you'd know by holding a salmon, which the students we were working with, many of them had not held a salmon. And so we looked at people holding different kinds of salmon that would be found in the river. This led to all kinds of really great conversations as kids were stretching their hands out and trying to think, my hands are smaller than an adult hand, and how does that feel? And what it really helped connect was that we learn by doing, and we learn by feeling, and that this is knowledge that someone would have if they had done it and they had felt it. So that started to build connection to the fishing weir along with the math that was part of it. So then we sent the kids outside, and the school had a beautiful nature space that we could use. And the first thing that we invited the students to do was, in their groups, to find something that they could use like the rock was used to space the cedar poles apart. There weren't a lot of rocks, so the kids started to go to other natural items, including lots of different pieces of wood. And so they would bring us the different pieces, they'd compare it with friends, and they'd think about how wide would that salmon have been. And that started to really bring to light more of the math that was happening. And the kids really started to acknowledge the person who was building that fishing weir, the knowledge that they had from the experiences that they had. So once they had that piece, then we had them use really thin bamboo skewers to start the idea of placing the poles apart. This led to all kinds of math questions that didn't just connect to math, but it also connected to students understanding place in the fishing weir. So the students started to, they struggled to put those little sticks into the ground. And so they started to talk about, how did they hold the rock under the water? Could they see it? How deep was the water? How cold was the water? And we just thought these questions were so great. And we had to say, we don't know the answers to all of these, friends. But I think it was a humbling experience for us and for them to share that. As they continued to make longer fish traps across the spaces that they were using, questions started to happen like, how wide was the river, and how many cedar poles would have been needed, and how did they get them into the dirt? And they thought about what's at the bottom of that creek, at the bottom of the river, because we're having a hard time getting it into dirt. How would you have gotten it in with rushing water coming? And so through this experience, the kids were really starting to connect and ask questions that always lead to, I think, a deeper understanding. And so when we finished the work that we did outside, and we finished the work outside, we gathered together and we asked them the question of, what do you know now that you didn't know before? We wanted it to be very open-ended. And they had some really insightful things to share. They talked about, they thought that they understood a little bit better about how the fishing weir worked, but that they also had more of an appreciation for how people knew how to create the fishing weir and how you would build it. They were really fascinated by the torch out of the salmon head. They continued to talk about that. They also did notice the math that's involved. And there was some discussion around how some fish could get through, but not all fish could get through, and how thoughtful that was, and understanding that the fish needed to go through in order to sustain the fish population. So there was that part of it as well. They also were thoughtful in talking about how communities need to work together and that they can learn from stories. So then Taryn and I reflected about, what do we know now? And I'm going to share what I know now that I didn't know before. And I think a big piece was just how deeply students and myself could learn about math through land and place. I think I experienced a lot of reciprocal learning. The students were learning, but at the same time, I felt like I was learning so much. I also thought about, and even the way that I've shared this with you today was how we shared it with students. We really focused on place first. And that's not typically how I would engage with a story, and how important that is when sharing an Indigenous story, that we are considering what the land is and where the place is. It's a big part of that story. I also think, I think I knew it before, but I think part of what was really important to me and why we were successful is that I was willing to be wrong. There's probably still things that I have done wrong, and I will realize that maybe not today, but at a later date. But knowing that you have to try it, and it's okay that I didn't have everything fully understood. And it was a humbling experience to really learn right alongside the students. I've been part of the Indigenous community culture math education group for 2 years, and I think that gave me a lot of the confidence to put into action what I've learned about Indigenous story work. And it has continued to spark a deeper curiosity for me about how can I continue to learn about Indigenous cultures and communities, and how can I find ways to see math through that in the work that I do with teachers and with students.
Okay, thanks, Tawnie. That's got us a wonderful start, connecting story to place, to culture, to mathematics. And we'll start with our first curriculum responder, Monica, who will share some thoughts briefly, and then we'll go to Sandra.
Thanks a lot, Joanne. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So before I give my extension suggestions, I do want to honor that I am on the traditional territory of the Secwepemc people. I know you said that earlier. It's being a math and science teacher for all those years, I automatically want to connect those two curriculums. So I don't know if you can share the slide deck again while I'm talking. But I think I threw some slides in there. But one of my suggestions was to connect Science 9 and Math 9. In the big ideas of the curriculum for Science 9, you have First Peoples knowledge of interconnectedness and sustainability when we talk about the different spheres. And in the Math 9 curriculum, you have the linear relations. So I've just put those big ideas right up there and then connected them to the First Peoples principles of learning. And my suggestion would be to talk about take the story of Chehalis and kind of use that as a springboard to work together for talking about a common purpose. So then when we take something out of an ecosystem, how it affects other species in the ecosystem. The cultus sockeye, for instance, like that's one of the keystone species for that ecosystem. And then students could be graphing their findings and showing how when one species in an area goes down in population, then it sometimes causes the other ones to increase, and what that looks like moving forward. Another suggestion, which shockingly, physics is near and dear to my heart. I never would have said that at one point in my life. But Physics 11 and Math 10, and you can actually cover this at either grade level, and you can be talking about the runner. So you can look at that from the perspective of what is your role and what's your generational role and responsibility in the community. But then you can also tell the story, the entire story of Chehalis, in the context of a graph. So they could be graphing the foot runner velocity, the salmon swim rate, the volume of water flowing past a certain point in the weir over time. By doing that, kids start to understand the power that graphs can have. And I think that when they don't have context, graphs lose a lot of things. So if you have a story that you can connect it to, it just makes that learning really, really intentional for the kids. And then the third suggestion was, if you want to stick to straight math, I would definitely take the grade 4 or 5 original target audience to a grade 9 level, where they could actually do proportional reasoning and scale factor, and they could actually design a fishing weir, and then they could scale it down. So you would go to what your local tributaries are, and you would say, okay, so here's the actual distance from bank to bank. And then the kids would go, okay, and then we want to put a fish in here. And it's funny, I used to work for fisheries, and I don't know who I learned this from, but it was a landowner, and he used to say the way they used to figure it out was to figure out, they would just put their fingers together like this to figure out the distance. And I wish I could remember that guy's name, but it was over 25 years ago, so I can't. But I do remember him telling me that. So yeah, the Math 9 connection to proportional reasoning, and then drawing an actual to scale map of what the weirs would look like kind of around with the different tributaries.
Okay, great. Thanks, Monica. You sparked a lot of great ideas there. So let's continue now with Sandra as our other curriculum responder.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the presentation, Tawnie. I'm coming to this event today from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I just want to position myself too as a settler of white ancestry and living in an urban environment, which sometimes the place that I live and connect to and the land can be quite different. And I was looking at, so Cynthia, I did have some slides that were before Monica's, I guess. Yeah, so Tawnie, when I was thinking about your work, this slide that you used really like captured me because the sizes of the salmon are so different. And then so I started thinking too, like, okay, the size, so then how do they determine like how is the space between the cedar poles determined? Because like based on, you don't want to catch small salmon, but then they're different types and they're different sizes. And so I started thinking, I wonder if they come at different months of the year. And sure enough, they did. And then I really started diving into the salmon life cycle and how long the different species spend in different phases of the life cycle. So then I started thinking around ratios and percents, and then along with, like, Monica went to graphing with grade 7 and circle graphs and connecting that to their fractions and percent, and looking at the time that different species spend in different stages of the life cycle. So you can see here one for the Chinook salmon and one for the sockeye salmon. And I did have to do a lot of estimating and sort of figuring things out based on reading. So things like they spend the winter in here or something, or like the spring and then they move. So making some estimations and then converting some of those months into a decimal number related to years, and then creating some circle graphs. So, and then the other thing that's interesting to talk to with students is, even though these, you can look at, say, the dark blue section that's very similar in size in the circle graph, the life cycle, the length of a salmon's life is dependent on its species too. So that even though the portion of the pie looks the same, it's actually like the number that it represents in months or years is different. So I thought there's lots of different conversations that could be had there, and just connecting like to the land through a species or a more than human relation that we can understand that story through, and that's what came to light there. And then I also thought about the foot runner and connecting the place of Chehalis with the student's local place. So I'm in Vancouver, so we're quite removed from there. But maybe, again, looking at connections to ratio percent, and even down in grade 4 or 5 with fractions, but relating the distance that the foot runner had to go maybe in one journey, and how that relates to distances that the students might travel on a regular basis by foot or another accessible mean. Or even connecting it to other stories. So how far did Raven travel, like across the land in Raven Brings the Light, or how far Cloudwalker's circle was, or other people that they know, like Terry Fox, or how far did the salmon travel returning, and just making comparisons. And I think you could even compare in order numbers without going into the proportional relationship, even as far down as grade 2, depending on the size of numbers. So that's my connections to place, was the species of animals, and connecting the student's place to Chehalis as well.
Wonderful. Thank you both, Monica and Sandra. You've given some really, I think, fun and exciting and very thoughtful ideas for applications to various grade levels. We have probably right now just a couple of minutes for maybe a question. So I would ask if you have a question, a burning question you'd like to ask Tawnie, that you unmute your mic and ask, or if you would like to put your question in the chat. And if we don't get time to answer it now, we could answer it later there. So we'll just give a couple of minutes for any questions. And there's lots of comments. We appreciate the comments in the chat.
I have a question for Sandra's extension of Tawnie's.
Yeah, go ahead.
While people are just thinking. Did you look for the data to create these graphs here, Sandra?
So I inferred some of it, but I did find some different sites that I got data from, like more paragraph form, but with the numbers in it saying like how many years or how many months they spend. So it was really having to think about interpreting the information and sort of finding out and thinking like, okay, if they stay in this freshwater for the spring, what could that mean? And thinking about how that relates to a year. And then, yeah, and then I used Excel. So there's that opportunity to use technology too in creating
Thank you.
these.
Maybe Fred, could you want to ask your question?
Well, I was just imagining how we might model in, say, an urban setting, what the water flow would be affected by creating a weir, and thinking how you could then naturalize science into this idea of experimentation, which then brings in the mathematics of flow rates and how fast things are moving through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's another great connection. So I think we can continue with the chat and return to this idea that you've posed, Fred, about connecting science with math, and there might be other ideas too. So let's move on to our next presenters.
Thank you. And thank you for the amazing presentation so far, and the curricular responses that are taking and trying to think of adaptations to the lesson that was already, and the stories that were already shared. So giving lots of good ideas. So next we have Carol, who will talk a little bit about her lessons, connecting math and story and place. So Carol.
Okay, thank you. I also want to thank Tawnie, Monica, and Sandra for the wonderful ideas. I got some great ideas there for myself to try with my kiddos. I'm going to start with, I once heard a Gitxsan educator say, and I felt like they were saying it strictly to me, there is power in the language. I interpreted this as, okay, they're telling me to take the language of mathematics outside. So it took me a bit to gain the confidence to connect culture, land, and place to math. So I started taking my kids out onto the land, just outside, walking a short 10 minutes behind our school here. There's a beautiful lake where they observe and engage their senses. Here I learn about what they know about the environment and whose grandparents have taught them about the land. We repeat this exercise several times throughout the year, mostly to engage all their senses and practice written reflections. And most importantly, I stress it's important for them to use their voice. Then eventually, to their dismay, I challenge them to find the math outside. So what I've just described is the first 2 weeks of my semester. I don't even bother with the academics. I get to know my learners by focusing on their core competencies. For me, this feels the power of teaching and learning mathematics through land and place. So there's power in the language of the land and what has happened here. So as you can see, the red balloon, Cynthia stated 55 degrees north is my latitude. You see Seattle to situate those people from the States, and the east, Seattle is down at the bottom there. I am a 15-hour drive north of Vancouver. Just below that red balloon, you can see a faint line. That's the Highway 16. As you can see on the photo on the left, that's a better photo of Highway 16. It's a very lonely, it's a very remote road where we require a vehicle to get anywhere to any other community. It's a typical stretch of the highway. It's also known as the Highway of Tears because there's been more than 40 Indigenous people that have gone missing or have been murdered along this stretch of highway. You may also know this stretch of highway as the Trans-Canada Highway. It runs from Haida Gwaii in the northern parts of BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan to Winnipeg, Manitoba. Okay, so if I listen to the power of place, I was thinking, as I walked down the halls, there were posters plastered around the school inviting the kids to come bead red dresses. I was beyond excited, so I share my thoughts. Sweet, I have a project for my 2D and 3D unit. I don't even have to plan it, it's right there. But wait, I can't have my learners bead a red dress without providing any context to the red dress. I cannot assume because we all travel the highway that we all know the significance of the red dress. So as a class, we brainstormed what we knew about missing murdered Indigenous women. We discussed how we can overcome prejudice and bias, if mathematics was divorced from the real world, and how math is about inferring, hypothesizing, analyzing, and drawing conclusions. So in this photo, the kids did scale down a red dress and they scaled up a red dress, and then they actually attempted to bead the red dress. Only one of the kids actually finished the red dress. Lesson learned here, this is a challenging task for first-time beaders. Yes, sorry. Then as we sat around beading, we discussed as a class the RCMP I had on the board, the RCMP, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women National Operation Overview. And it became evident that I could expand this red dress project into the data analysis unit. So luckily for me, I'd already covered this unit. The kids already knew about bias, perspective. Hooray. So I listened to the voice of place and ended up with an extension to the beading. So I just read what Janice said. Okay. So what's happening here? Together, we explored the learning of mathematics through place as the numbers had begun to tell the story. We had already, I introduced the data with the RCMP perspective. I used slow reveal graphs for the learners to notice and wonder. The learners noticed that the RCMP report focused on numbers. And some of the comments were, we are just numbers. Look, they just labeled missing and murdered Indigenous women as missing or homicide. This is kind of cold. Those were the boys mostly. It's kind of cold. Learners immediately noticed that there were colors on the map. The learners noticed that the colors, it was very bright, it was circular, that the pieces were equal in size, and they also wondered what human rights were violated in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report. They also noticed I was presenting my bias and my perspective by focusing on the seven violated human rights, and by keeping the RCMP data in tables or emphasizing the 3D pie chart graph. I kind of thought it was funny that they didn't notice my pie graph was circular as well, but they definitely noticed that the missing and murdered Indigenous women one perspective was circular. Next came the independent learning of mathematics. The kids independently analyzed the RCMP report and the missing and murdered Indigenous women reports to look for meaningful data. They shared their analysis with the class. Learners noticed that both reports were wordy, that it was challenging to weed through the numbers when data was presented in words. They all knew someone that had gone missing, or they could relate to the violated human rights, because in our remote area, we struggle primarily with the right to access to health and the right to justice. So in short, the kids found that the Indigenous perspective more relatable because they felt it gave them a voice, whereas the RCMP report was cold, especially with the term homicide. So my kids really emphasized that term cold. They found the RCMP cold and homicide. So they were showing their perspective and bias in their discussion. Okay. The learners shared their learning around the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women through numbers. They were asked to select three different data sets from the reports and present the data in a graph of their choice and explain their perspective and bias in choosing the format to present the numbers. As you can see, they need guidance on sharing their perspective and bias. So we reverted to one-on-one conferencing. I do a lot of one-on-one conference with my kids where they're more comfortable verbally discussing their perspective and bias, and just in general, more comfortable discussing what they know. For me, part of teaching and learning mathematics requires learner voice. My kids know that I expect them to share with me verbally. However, they still need support with their writing, as you can see another example here, especially when they need to talk about their strengths. So if they struggle, I say, can you think of 5? I can think of 5 of your strengths off the top of my head. And I wait. If they still struggle, I share one strength, usually something like you take risk when you're contributing to class discussions, or you're good at listening to your peers. Then I tell them, okay, it's your turn. Tell me one of your strengths. And then they're a little bit more comfortable sharing their strengths. They easily pick up their challenges, but I try not to focus on that. I redirect them to their strengths. The curricular competence outcomes in the middle there, they picked those. We discussed those as a class on what they wanted to focus on. So some verbal comments that stood out more because my kids were really verbal as opposed to writing was that experiential learning is better, but I found it hard to connect math to missing and murdered Indigenous women at first. Or I didn't think missing and murdered Indigenous women should be taught in math, but now I see why you taught in math. It's good to understand the numbers. Part of teaching and learning comes with culture and connection to the land. After the issues and numbers were explored, we extended our voice to the community. My class got shy, they didn't want to speak, so I opened it up to the whole school. I asked a variety of females, males, non-binary students. And here is one of the grade 8s that stood up, and she gave me permission to share her photo. So after the issues in class and numbers were explored, we extended our voice to the community, chiefs, matriarchs, neighboring communities. So there's 7 neighboring communities that feed into my school. We're invited to the learner-led missing and murdered Indigenous women gathering. As our young leaders shared their stories, the audience was opening to learning from them. Their peers gained a better understanding of their Indigenous peers as they openly shared how colonial ways had impacted their lives. It was very, very empowering to hear the kids. Sorry. Okay, it was an honor to hear the young people give back to others through intergenerational learning. I did this with my class too. I cried. That's okay, they know. Their out-centered spirits of the speakers and community were strengthened by being around our matriarchs who supported the kids in traditional ways, while their physical and emotional self were healed through ceremony with one of our chiefs who took them aside after the girls spoke. Okay, so the girls wore their hearts on their sleeves. They taught and we learned through place as they shared the impacts of colonialism, such as the treatment from RCMP. They see lots of RCMP dressed in full military garb around here sometimes. During MCFD, forcibly removing family members and the prejudice that they experience on a daily basis. The audience included a local NDP politician, credit union, and the local college managers, RCMP, a professional photographer, that's Elizabeth Larson, who took these photos, as well as chiefs, matriarchs, and most of the high school population. The teaching and learning through place continued into the feast hall that evening. I was very honored to witness that. One of the chiefs that was at this gathering, they stood up and shared just how powerful it was to hear the young ladies stand up and speak about the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Okay. We witnessed the power of teaching and learning through place when the entire crowd was engaged with our speakers. The girls were just so powerful. You can see in the photos here, everybody's listening. The high school kids listened with empathy, and non-Indigenous people gained a better understanding of how the youth are perceived and treated in society. By listening with their hearts, the high school kids gave their respect to the storytellers, which in turn honored the speakers' spirit. What should happen here? To further deepen mathematical understanding with place, this spring I aspire to have my workplace Math 10 and 11 classes share their ideas in a poster session with the community. I want to invite the community, the kids have their posters, they share what they know. I want to do that the same day that Angela Starrett is going to come to share her story or read from her book, Unbroken. And I did want my grade 8s, because I've already taken them comparison shopping to prepare for a feast. I wanted to take them to shop for my grade 10s as they learn to order food, plan a menu, etc., for a gathering to feed a couple hundred people. And then this grade 10s and 11s would prepare and prep the food. But today I found out that the 131 funds are not available to support curricular outcomes. So my backup plan is to have an all nations feast, which just means that whoever can bring something to share. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Carol. Very, very powerful. I used that word a few times to describe it. I think I have shivers, excuse me, on my back as well. So, Sandra, I think you're up. Monica was first and you were second. So now we'll invite you, Sandra, to provide some insights for adaptation to Carol's work.
Thank you, Carol, for sharing the amazing work that you and your students have done. And I always learn so much from you, and today was no exception. So I'm going to thank Carol too for having a couple email exchanges with me, but also knowing about this project ahead of time. I mentioned it to colleagues yesterday too, so I do want to honor that some of my ideas were sparked from these communications. But when I saw this one, Carol, and I wasn't exactly sure maybe what you would speak to, so one of my ideas too, as I looking at this slide, and especially the picture on the right, was noticing the different sizes of the dresses and wondering if you were working with scaling. So I was thinking of that with applying ratios to with grade 6s and 7s, and looking at how you might take a design and scale it down for maybe something that's wearable, but or scale it up for a display. And of course, always in the context, like you said, like we're not just gonna do a red dress with no meaning behind it, but in that context of educating students about the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and the meaning of the red dress. So I was thinking around that with the ratios and drawing, and whether it could be done, you know, with beading or like out of felt, but like that, why would we need to scale things, and how do we involve math in that? So that was my takeaway from this, that we could use the red dresses in a way to contribute to community displays around the red dresses and scaling them for different purposes. And then Carol, in your communication, you mentioned 2 phrases to me, and it was high rate of tears and right to health. And I really wanted, also, I was curious about the data from the RCMP and that, but I also really wanted to honor your students and how they were recognizing the numbers bit. And I know I need to sit with it longer as an educator before I would be working with data that involves humans in that way, to not reduce that. So I was like, how can I bring this maybe into a data connection like you were working with, but triggered by the highway of tears and the right to health. So I started thinking about connection to place, and how far removed, like where you are, can seem to those of us down south. And we probably have very little perspective about why the calls to justice are in the final report of the inquiry, and especially the one around community-based and access health and culturally based health. So I was, and it's not fully thought out, but I'm seeing the connection to comparing, possibly through graphing, distances between healthcare access. So hospitals in the north along the Highway of Tears, and where the different major healthcare centers are. And if someone needed treatments for certain things, how far away it is from their community, or if it's in their community. But then comparing that, so being down in Vancouver, comparing the distances someone here might need to travel for healthcare. So I think that can go from, if we're just looking at basic comparisons of numbers, down into the upper primary, depending on the size of the numbers. And then if we want to be like even comparing through graphing, we can push that through the intermediate grades. But that's where I was connecting this, like, how do we have perspective down here? And maybe it is comparing the distances from up north to what we know down here, and noticing the differences for some understanding of the report and the right to health. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Some very interesting extensions and adaptations, both in the content as well as the grade levels there. Thank you. And now I'll invite Monica to share some thoughts.
Okay, I just want to start by thanking Carol for not only sharing your project, but for being brave enough to take on what is an extremely difficult but important topic to talk about, not just with students, but with the whole community. This was a really emotional thing to read, your project. I did a good portion of my teaching career in Quesnel. And so I really do think about the Highway of Tears often. And I kept thinking about the First Peoples Principles of Learning, where it says learning is embedded in memory, history, and story. And every time I thought about a different extension, I thought that Yeah, I could move this to grade 8, but I just worried about the age of the grade 8s and wondered if perhaps they would not be able to have these conversations yet. But another place that it can be brought into Workplace Math 10, I thought was in terms of the relationship between the surface area and volume of 3D objects. And this is why I was thinking that I started to look at, and you'll see a picture on that slide there. That's a print called Freedom from the local Gitson artist, Trevor Angus. And it's, as we can see, it's a butterfly coming out of its cocoon. And my thought was that you could, after doing the work that you've done, so I would definitely qualify this. I wouldn't do just this, but a way of honoring these stories was the students could perhaps build a 3D box and cover it with their own art that would symbolize coming and exposing that story and how we move from hiding in the cocoon to bringing it to light. And so then perhaps at your celebration, and I don't know if that's the right word, but I think it's probably more of a ceremony to recognize. But they could hold the box, and they, inside the box could be a story that they connected with or a story that they wrote. And then when they open it up, the net is akin to the opening up of the cocoon, and then share the story of that person and their life, because they're no longer here for them to share their story. So it's to give them a voice when theirs was taken, literally exposing their story to all. And then I think they could reflect on how they could support one another in the community through loss, through that sharing circle. I think that could be a really powerful experience.
Well, I love all the ideas. I like the cocoon analogy and the bent box. Well, bent box, yeah.
Even how you started the presentation, Carol, with 2 weeks of just building relationships in place on the land in order to feel that you had a safe space to bring this up, that you and the students could then, move into a very difficult topic to be able to explore. So yeah, and so now, are there any questions or comments that others have to Carol or to either of the curriculum corresponders? So I see that Anna has your hand. Yeah, there you are, Anna. Go for it.
Hi, Carol. Thank you so much for sharing this important work that you've done with your students. A long time ago, I taught in SC91, and so I'm really hoping that some of my former students might have been present in your classroom when you did that work, and were able to share in your such a deep knowledge. It was really evident from the I'm also tearing up now. It was really evident from the pictures that you shared, the student self-reflections, your emotion, and everybody's reactions to the work, the deep and powerful and connected learning that was shared. And it just was such a great reminder of, I recently learned about Rachel Gutierrez's work, Si Se Puede, down in Chicago, about that critical access of using math for learning about cultural identity and history, and math as a part of identity, and then moving towards using math for power to change and to advocate for change. And I think this is a wonderful example of it, and there's so much rich learning here. I'm wondering, though, because you have so much evidence from the students and their actions in their curricular competencies and in their math learning, what the students sort of felt and how you felt as the teacher assessing them in this like colonial something out of 32 classroom assessment model. Would you perhaps maybe shift to a way of giving descriptive feedback and doing self-assessment?
It was 100% self-assessment, student focus. They chose the so I pull out the curricular competencies, I put it into plain English. They chose what they want to focus on. They gave their strengths and their challenges, but they still needed help with being proud of their strengths. So their grade, some of them were they were all very honest. We agreed, or they decided that they wanted it out of 40. So I had to mark it out of 40 because that's what I wanted. This was, yeah, no, they decided, we discussed that as a class, because I tell them there's no right answer as long as you back up your choice, your voice. Yeah, that's how that went.
And this, especially with the new student reporting policy and some of the supports for classroom assessment coming out, that there might be space to not have to quantify it if that's something that your students and yourself as the teacher choose to do in the future, where having the feedback and the student self-reflection is enough and powerful as an assessment piece for the students to show them their math learning.
Yeah, no, this year I haven't given a grade. The kids actually aren't even asking, they're getting the feedback on the strengths. And yeah, it's my first year ever that they're not asking, what's my grade? What's my grade? I have a couple of kids that are constantly asking that, but that's because they've never actually worked with me before. So they're the ones that are constantly asking. But there's only a handful of them out of my 100 kids that I teach.
Thank you.
Anna, thank you for your question. Can you share with us your background? Your question seems to me to connect to some thoughtful readings. I'm just wondering what your background is.
My cultural background, or my professional background.
Yeah, thinking your professional.
I'm a curriculum coordinator with the Ministry of Education, and my current project is working with the learning pathways. So looking at how literacy and numeracy especially are infused in all areas of the curriculum and how we're all numeracy teachers.
Yes, very nice. Good, thank you. Thank you for your question and for joining. Okay, we have time for maybe a question from the chat. If this is very hard to read as we're going through it, but I see Fred again. Fred has a question. Carol's project made me wonder on the coldness of the report. Could it be the social distancing police need for such gruesome situations like murders to maintain their own mental health? Yeah, I mean, thinking about the mental health and well-being of those who are working on the project itself, or the situation, the events themselves, certainly. Was there a 4-piece explaining it? Explaining the report, you're asking, Fred? Okay. So Carol?
So the cold aspect, where did they get the cold from?
I think he's wondering that if the RCMP report, how it was introduced.
Yeah, the front matter, like in the curriculum, explaining big ideas, etc. Most people skip over that and go right to what they call the meat and potatoes of it. And I'm wondering if there was a piece explaining how their emotional well-being needs to talk about numbers, not about people, because it's just too hard to come home from work. I know one of my counseling friends said that there's a rock in the road, and every time I reach that rock, I drop all the cares of my counseling at school at that rock and go home to my family. I'll pick those cares up at the rock on my way back. And this idea of just keeping a separation, because it's got to eat at you, just the way Carol's emotions showed through when she spent so much time on the project, and knowing the lives of these people, that affects her every time she thinks about it. So
Yeah,
it just made me think about the social emotional aspects of doing a report.
yeah, that's the first thing that crossed my mind, and it was ironically me that was most impacted. I sent home letters to the families about a month before that I would be talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women. I explained what I would be talking about. I had the counselors and a couple of chiefs and a couple of the matriarchs at the ready to address these supports, but it turned out to be mostly me that needed the support, and then the girls after they spoke.
Mhm.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you, Carol. Okay. I'm just noticing our time and I want to give a minute or two for any comments that go across the two presentations that you heard today. Anything, any connections that you're making or any learning that you have that you'd like to share, you could, raise your hand and unmute and go for it, or you could put something in the chat. That would be really helpful for us to see, what are you making connections to? And while you're doing that, Calvin has dropped a poll for us to respond to, so you can be doing that at the same time. As we're all educators, we're multitaskers. So if you can, say something maybe about a learning or something that stood out for you with this session. And I'm just going to share my screen one last time here to also mention that we have 2 more sessions coming up. There's a QR code there. You can register. Well, actually, you're already registered. If you're here, you're registered for all of our sessions. But just to put the date in your calendar, February 27th and April 9th for the 3rd and 4th session of this series on centering Indigenous pedagogies in math education. I guess we can wrap it up there then. I want to thank everyone for joining and sharing by being here, being part of this community, and offering your thoughts in the chat. And for those who are able to also offer some thoughts by unmuting. And thank you to our presenters and curriculum responders for the time you took to think carefully and deeply about the work, to offer some adaptations and extensions to the work across grade levels, across subject areas, and across mathematical content. So Joanne, would you like to say a few things?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, thank you very much. I raise my hands in thanks and respect to our presenters, Tawnie and Carol, and to our curriculum responders, Monica and Sandra, and to our team members, Janice, Leyton, and Cynthia, for such an engaging session. We've really have also challenged our heart, mind, body, and spirit, but we've challenged ourselves, I think, in good ways, that we know that the land is there, the place, and that the land can be there to help us. And also, the land can be there when there are difficulties. And then it makes us think about the place, that location, the meaning, and then what we might do. So I think today we've had 2 different examples of where there's the land and the place, and there were some difficulties in each of the place, but the Indigenous people figured out ways to deal with those difficulties. And I think we have the current day place too. And even though we have, the Highway of Tears is a difficult place, but, we feel inspired by what has happened, Carol, and how you have worked with the community and the students to really think about the place. And I really loved how you had the students learn about the place in a good way, that place is beauty and power and healing, but there are difficulties, of a place that have been done by humans in a way. And then Tawnie, you've also helped us think about those important stories that were told by the dear elders, long ago stories that still have application today, and so we have had a feast today, I think, of these ideas about place and mathematics, and thinking about the power of teaching with both of those. And we've had wonderful ideas that have sparked, I hope, some thoughts and questions for all of you who have taken time out of your busy schedules to join us today. So we'll go away and really think about what we've heard, what we saw, and what we felt, and think about what are we going to do as a result of all of that. So we look forward to the next session of our webinar, and hope you will all return, and that we'll still continue on with good conversations and good thoughts that we share. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you at our next session. This session contained a section of sensitive content. If you need support and require emotional assistance or referral services related to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, or for more information, visit the links in the description notes below associated with this recording.